What would you do if the only thing your father left you was an accusation? If the wage he'd earned with his life was stolen by the very men who sent him into the dark, and your demand for justice got you thrown out onto a dusty road with nothing but the clothes on your back and a name they'd already begun to tarnish? For Emma Whitcomb, this was no idle question. It was the hard granite of her reality in the autumn of 1883. The Consolidated Mercy Mining Company had declared her father's death an accident, his final pay a pittance swallowed by company store debt, and her a troublemaker for daring to suggest otherwise. But what the foreman, Silas Thorne, didn't know was that her father had left her one other thing: a faded survey note, folded into a square no bigger than her palm. It spoke not of silver or gold, but of a place, a waterfall in the high San Juans, marked with a cryptic annotation: "Where the water hides the stone's memory." Everyone told her it was a fool's map, a ghost story whispered by a dying man. But the truth waiting behind that curtain of falling water was older and deeper than any mine, a secret sealed for nearly a century, ready to wash away a mountain of lies. Settle in and stay close as we follow a daughter's search for justice into the heart of the Colorado wilderness. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, as we uncover a story of courage, loss, and the quiet strength of a forgotten claim. Emma Whitcomb stood on the edge of the company town of Mercy, the dust of its single road clinging to the hem of her worn wool skirt. Behind her, the black maw of the mine scarred the mountainside, a place that had taken her father's breath and then his name. Before her lay the vast, indifferent expanse of Colorado. She had been given an hour to pack. It had taken her 10 minutes. There was little to take: a change of clothes, a dented tin cup, her mother's locket, and the folded paper from her father's lockbox. Silas Thorne had watched her go, his arms crossed over his barrel chest, a smirk playing on his lips. He thought he had won. He had the company ledgers, the town's fear, the silence of men who needed their wages more than they needed the truth. He had erased her father. She felt the sharp corners of the note through the thin fabric of her pocket. It was all that was left of him, a final whispered instruction. She started walking, not toward the distant promise of Denver or the familiarity of the flatlands she'd come from, but up into the mountains that had already taken everything. Her father, a quiet man who read geology like other men read the Bible, had been tracing old claims for the company, tidying up their holdings. But in his last letters, his tone had shifted. He wrote of histories buried, of lines on maps that didn't match the land, of a story the rocks themselves wanted to tell. Thorne had called it delusion. Emma called it a trail. Her boots, thin-soled and cracked, found a rhythm on the hard-packed earth. Each step was an act of defiance. The sun beat down, the air grew thin, and the silence of the high country settled around her, a heavy blanket of pine and stone. She was alone, a solitary figure against a landscape that swallowed solitary figures whole. But grief, she was learning, was a kind of fuel. It burned cold and slow, a blue flame in the center of your chest that didn't warm you, but it kept you moving. The note in her pocket was a compass pointing not to a treasure, but to a reckoning. And as the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the valley, she knew she would follow it, even if it led her off the edge of the world. The nearest supply outpost, hardly a town at all, was a place called Redemption. It consisted of a general store, a livery, and a handful of cabins clinging to the banks of a shallow creek. It was a place people passed through, not a place they stayed. When Emma showed the survey note to the old man behind the counter at the store, he squinted at it through spectacles thick as bottle glass. He pushed them up his forehead and laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "This old thing? That's the Bishop's Folly. Been a legend in these parts for 50 years. He explained that an old prospector, mad as a hatter, claimed a waterfall in the upper basin hid the entrance to a lost Spanish mine. "Died chasing it," the clerk finished, tapping a stained finger on the counter. "Same as your pa, I reckon, chasing ghosts." The words were meant to be dismissive, but they landed like confirmation. Her father hadn't been delusional. He'd been following a story. A man overheard them from the corner of the store, where he was checking a list against a sack of flour. He was tall and lean, with a quiet stillness about him that seemed out of place in the restless world of prospecting. His face was weathered, his hands calloused, but his eyes were clear and steady. He didn't mock. He just watched. Emma bought what she could afford, a small sack of oats, a hook and line, and a handful of matches. As she turned to leave, the quiet man spoke. "That note," he said, his voice low and even. "It's a geologic survey mark from the 1805 expedition." He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the paper in her hand. Most folks think they're just reference points. They're not. They're records. He introduced himself as Edward Pike. He had been an assayer, he said, before his wife passed. Now he mostly kept to himself. He looked from the note to Emma's face, seeing not a foolish girl, but the same stubborn set of the jaw he remembered in his own wife. "A waterfall that size, it can change the face of the rock over 80 years, he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It can hide things, or protect them." He offered nothing more, just that small seed of validation. It was more than anyone else had given her. She thanked him and left, the weight of the town's doubt pressing in on her. She was a woman alone, chasing a dead man's fantasy. The sensible thing to do was to turn around, find work in a real town, and forget. But her father's tired face rose in her memory, the smudge of coal dust permanently etched into the lines around his eyes. He had believed in this. He had died believing in it. That belief was her inheritance now, the only one she had left. What secret was her father chasing into the high mountains? Was this old note a map to a forgotten fortune? Or was it, as everyone claimed, just a fool's errand, the last obsession of a grieving man? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of the Forgotten West. Now, with the whispers of an entire town at her back, Emma Whitcomb turned her face to the peaks, ready to find the truth, no matter the cost. The next morning, as Emma was buying a used pickaxe and a coil of rope she couldn't rightly afford, Silas Thorne rode into Redemption. His horse was a big black stallion that seemed to take up the whole road, and Thorne sat atop it like a king on a shabby throne. He saw her immediately, standing outside the general store with her meager new supplies. A cruel, knowing smile spread across his face. He reined in his horse, the animal dancing nervously, kicking up dust. "Well, look here," Thorne boomed, his voice carrying across the quiet street. The few people out and about stopped to watch. "Miss Whitcomb, still playing the prospector, are we? Heard you were asking about the Bishop's Folly." He laughed, a loud, ugly sound that made her flinch. "My dear girl, your father filled his head with fairy tales. It's what got him killed. He stopped watching the timber supports and started watching the rocks for signs and portents. You'd be wise to get on the next stagecoach east and forget this place ever existed." He leaned down from his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial sneer. "There's nothing for you up there but cold nights and disappointment. Go home." Emma met his gaze, her own quiet and unyielding. She said nothing. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any argument could have. It was a language he didn't speak. He couldn't bully it, couldn't mock it, couldn't break it. It simply existed, a small, solid thing in the face of his bluster. With a curse, he spurred his horse and galloped out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and humiliation in his wake. The townspeople went back to their business, but now their whispers had an edge of pity. The poor, foolish girl, going up against a man like Thorn. She shouldered her pack, the new weight of the tools, a comfort. As she walked toward the trail leading out of town, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see an old Ute woman sitting on a bench in front of the livery, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her black eyes holding a wisdom that felt as ancient as the mountains themselves. The woman's gaze was on the trail ahead, not on Emma, but she spoke as if they were in the middle of a long conversation. "The falling water sings an old song," the woman said, her voice like stones rubbing together in a riverbed. "It remembers what the mountain forgets." She never looked at Emma, just continued to watch the horizon. The words made no sense, yet they settled deep in Emma's bones, a strange and cryptic comfort. It felt less like a warning and more like a blessing. She nodded, though she wasn't sure the old woman even saw her, and continued on her way. The mockery of Silas Thorne faded behind her, replaced by the quiet hum of the wilderness and the echo of a strange, impossible promise. The mountain was waiting. The journey to the falls was a pilgrimage into solitude. The trail quickly dissolved from a wagon-rutted track into a faint deer path, then vanished altogether. Emma navigated by the sun and the contours of the land described on her father's note, her world shrinking to the next ridge, the next creek crossing, the next stand of aspen shimmering gold in the autumn light. The air grew crisp and thin, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. For 2 days, she saw no sign of another human soul. The only sounds were the cry of a hawk circling high above, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush, and the steady, rhythmic beat of her own heart. Her companion was the mountain itself, a vast and silent observer. She felt its presence in the weight of the granite cliffs that towered over her, and in the patient, grinding power of the streams that carved their way through stone. She thought of her father walking this same ground, his heart full of a discovery he couldn't yet name. Had he felt this same mix of fear and reverence? Had he felt the land speaking to him too? On the evening of the second day, she heard it. A low, distant roar, a constant thunder that was not of the sky, the waterfall. The sound grew as she climbed, a steady promise pulling her forward. She made camp that night within earshot of it, the roar a constant companion in the darkness. The next morning, she crested a final ridge and saw it. Bishop's Folly. It was more magnificent than she could have imagined. A solid curtain of white water plunged over 100 feet from a granite ledge into a churning, mist-filled pool below. The spray jeweled the surrounding pines and slicked the dark rocks with a permanent sheen of moisture. It was beautiful, powerful, and utterly, completely natural. Her heart sank. There was no cave, no entrance, no sign of anything man-made. It was just a waterfall, exactly as the clerk in Redemption had said. Disappointment, cold and sharp, pierced through the weary hope that had sustained her. She had come all this way for nothing. She had honored her father's last wish and found only a pretty piece of scenery. She spent the rest of the day sitting on a flat rock, watching the endless cascade, feeling the foolishness of her quest settle upon her like the cold mist. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, she prepared a small, cheerless fire. She would rest here for the night and begin the long, defeated walk back to redemption in the morning. The roar of the falls seemed to mock her now, a loud, empty sound. But as the world grew quiet and the first stars pricked the deep blue of the twilight sky, she heard something else, something beneath the roar. It was a strange, subtle echo, a rhythmic thump, thump, thump that seemed to come not from the water, but from the rock behind it. It was a sound that didn't belong. The next morning, Emma did not pack her things to leave. The sound from the night before, that strange, resonant echo, had planted a seed of doubt in her disappointment. She spent the day observing, not as a weary traveler, but as her father's daughter, a student of the stone. She moved along the slick, mossy edge of the pool, her eyes tracing the face of the cliff behind the water. The roar was deafening up close, the mist soaking her clothes, but she ignored the discomfort. From a distance, the cliff face had looked like any other. But up close, things were different. Most of the rock was fractured and uneven, the natural result of millennia of geology. But in the center, directly behind the thickest part of the cascade, the pattern was wrong. For a space perhaps 10 feet wide and 20 feet high, the rock was smoother, flatter. The cracks were too straight, the angles too perfect. It looked less like it had been carved by water and more like it had been dressed by tools. Decades of rushing water had worn it down, and a thick blanket of green, slick moss concealed much of it. But the underlying structure was subtly, undeniably artificial. A memory surfaced. Her father, sitting at their small cabin table, sketching in his notebook. He was explaining to her the difference between a natural fault line and a man-made seam. "Nature is messy, Emmy," he'd said, his pencil tracing a jagged line. "It wanders. Men build in straight lines. They think it's stronger that way." She scrambled closer, her boots slipping on the wet stones. She reached out a hand and pressed it against the mossy surface. It was cold and slick, but beneath the living green, the stone felt solid. Yet when she pushed, she felt a faint, deep vibration. The echo of the water hitting the rock. The same rhythmic pulse she'd heard the night before. It felt hollow. She remembered the Ute woman's words. It remembers what the mountain forgets. The water hadn't just been singing a song, it had been standing guard. It was a curtain, a perfect century-long concealment. There was something back there. A seam, a door, a sealed truth. The realization hit her not with a jolt of excitement, but with a wave of cold, terrifying certainty. She had found it. But finding it and reaching it were two very different things. The force of the water was immense. It would crush a person who tried to step through it. She had a pickaxe and a rope, tools for rock, not for water. She was strong, but she was not strong enough to fight a river falling from the sky. She looked back down the trail she had climbed, the long, lonely path back to redemption. She knew then that her journey wasn't over. It had just truly begun. She needed help, and there was only one person in that town who had looked at her, not with pity or scorn, but with understanding. The walk back to redemption felt different. The exhaustion was still there, a deep ache in her bones, but it was now overlaid with a thrum of purpose. She wasn't retreating in defeat. She was advancing for supplies. When she walked into the general store, the clerk looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected to see her broken. Instead, she looked harder, her jaw set, her eyes burning with a focused intensity. She bought another 100 feet of thick hemp rope, a block and tackle, and 2 heavy iron pry bars. The purchases drained her meager funds almost to nothing. As she was counting out her last few coins, the bell above the door chimed. Edward Pike stepped inside. He took in the scene at a glance. Emma, her face smudged with dirt and determination, and the pile of heavy equipment on the counter. He didn't ask what she'd found. He didn't need to. He simply walked over, his expression calm and serious. "That's a lot for one person to carry," he said. It wasn't a question or an offer, just a statement of fact. "I'll need a mule," she replied, her voice steady. "I have 2, he said, "and they're not busy." A silent understanding passed between them. He had seen the truth in her from the start, and now he was seeing it through. He helped her load the supplies onto one of his pack mules while he saddled the other. They left town without a word to anyone else, 2 quiet figures heading back into the wilderness that everyone else had dismissed. The journey back to the falls was faster with the mules. Edward was a man at home in the mountains, moving with an easy, ground-covering stride. He spoke little, but his presence was a comfort. He knew the names of the plants, the habits of the animals, the signs of changing weather. He was a part of the landscape in a way Emma was only just beginning to learn. When they arrived back at the falls, he stood for a long time, just watching the water, his assayer's eye taking in the details she had seen. "You're right," he said finally, his voice low against the roar. "That's dressed stone. And that echo. The water is hitting a sealed cavity, an air gap." The work began the next morning. It was slow, dangerous, and punishingly difficult. With his knowledge of ropes and leverage, Edward devised a system. They found a sturdy pine growing near the cliff edge above the falls and anchored the block and tackle to it. Then, using the mules to pull, they managed to rig a heavy rope that could be swung like a pendulum, allowing them to get close to the cliff face without being directly under the most powerful part of the cascade. Edward went first, testing the rig. He swung out over the churning pool, a small figure against the immense power of the water, and secured a new anchor point in a fissure on the rock wall. From there, they began the real work. For days they took turns swinging in, braced against the slick rock, chiseling and prying at the edges of the smooth stone face. The cold spray was relentless, seeping into their clothes and chilling them to the bone. Their hands grew raw and blistered, but with each chip of stone, each groan of the pry bar, they uncovered more of the truth. It was a perfectly fitted plug of granite, sealed with a mortar that had become nearly as hard as the rock itself. And along the top edge, almost completely worn away by the water, they found the faint traces of carving. A date, 1806, and a single proud letter W. Whitcomb. It took another full day of labor to break the seal. With a final, coordinated effort, both of them putting their weight on the largest pry bar, a deep groan echoed from the stone. A crack appeared, dark and stark against the wet granite. The ancient mortar, weakened by their efforts, began to crumble. With a great sucking sound, a section of the rock wall shifted inward, scraping against the sides of the opening it had sealed for 77 years. A blast of cold, stale air, smelling of dust and deep earth, washed over them, a breath held for generations. The roar of the falls seemed to diminish as a new, profound silence emanated from the darkness they had just uncovered. They had breached it. They had opened the door. After resting, letting the fresh air circulate into the passage, Edward lit a kerosene lantern. The flame flickered, casting a small, brave circle of golden light against the immense darkness. He handed it to Emma. "Your family's claim," he said quietly. "You should be the first." Her hand trembled as she took the lantern. She stepped over the threshold, out of the thundering present, and into the silent past. The passage was narrow, the walls showing the clear marks of hand tools. It ran straight back into the mountain for about 50 yards before opening into a small chamber. It was not a sprawling mine, but a prospector's test. The air was still and cold. In the center of the chamber, a small vein of dark, heavy ore glittered in the lantern light, a stripe of frozen lightning in the rock. But it wasn't the silver that held her attention. On a dry ledge tucked away to one side as if to protect it, sat a small tin box coated in a thick layer of dust. With reverent hands, Emma lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves, was a small leather-bound journal and a single heavy sample of ore, so rich with silver it felt like pure lead. She opened the journal. The handwriting was elegant, faded script. The first entry was dated July 1806. It was the journal of her great-great-grandfather, Jonathan Whitcomb. He wrote of discovering the vein, a find that would make his partners and his family prosperous for generations. But his partners, the founders of what would one day become the Consolidated Mercy Mining Company, had betrayed him. They wanted it all. The journal detailed their plan to seal the mine, file a false report claiming the area was barren, and wait until Jonathan's claim expired to return and take it for themselves. The final entry was chilling. Jonathan knew they were coming for him. He wrote that he was sealing his journal and the proof of his discovery in the mine itself, creating a time capsule of their treachery. "Let the water be my witness, and the mountain my vault," he had written. "One day, a Whitcomb will return. The stone will remember our name." Tears streamed down Emma's face, mixing with the spray of the falls still clinging to her clothes. It wasn't about stolen wages. It was about a stolen legacy. Her father hadn't been chasing a fantasy. He had been looking for this. He had been trying to reclaim his family's honor. They were so absorbed in the discovery, in the quiet reverence of the small chamber, that they didn't hear him approach. The first sign of trouble was a shadow that blocked the light from the entrance. Both Emma and Edward spun around, their hearts leaping into their throats. Silas Thorne stood there, a heavy pistol in his hand, his face a mask of triumphant greed. "I knew it," he sneered, his voice echoing in the confined space. "I knew the old man was onto something real. Hand it over, Miss Whitcomb. The journal." Behind him, two of his hired men from the camp blocked the narrow passage, their faces grim. Thorne must have grown suspicious, followed them from redemption. "This is a registered Whitcomb claim," Edward said, stepping in front of Emma, his voice low and steady despite the gun pointed at his chest. "You have no right." Thorne laughed. "Rights? In these mountains, rights belong to the man strong enough to take them. The company will be very grateful to me for discovering this little lost treasure. And you two, you'll just be a tragic accident. A cave-in. Happens all the time." As he spoke, the sky outside, which had been clear moments before, was darkening with alarming speed. A sudden, violent wind howled through the entrance, making the lantern flame dance wildly. A peal of thunder, so close and powerful it seemed to shake the very mountain, cracked overhead. A high country squall, born in the peaks, was descending upon them with brutal swiftness. The roar of the waterfall intensified, changing from a steady drone to a furious, angry bellow as the rain began to fall in sheets. Thorn glanced nervously toward the entrance. "Get the box," he ordered one of his men. But as the man moved forward, a deep, grinding roar, far louder than the thunder, filled the air. The ground shuddered. Rocks and debris began to cascade down from the passage ceiling. One of Thorn's men cried out as a large stone struck his leg, sending him to the ground. A massive slab of granite, dislodged by the torrential rain, slid down the cliff face and slammed into the mine's entrance, sealing it not with mortar, but with tons of solid rock. They were trapped. The lantern cast flickering, monstrous shadows on their faces. The only sound was the muffled roar of the storm and the pained groans of the injured man. Thorn's pistol was still in his hand, but his arrogance had vanished, replaced by the raw, primal fear of a man buried alive. In that moment, in the sudden, terrifying darkness, Emma made a choice. She looked at Thorn, not as an enemy, but as a trapped and frightened man. She looked at his injured crony moaning on the floor. She handed the lantern to Edward, then tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat. "We need to splint his leg," she said, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the panic. Her fight for justice had suddenly become a fight for survival, and she would not let vengeance cost them their humanity. The hours that followed were a long, slow crawl through a shared nightmare. The storm raged outside, a muffled but constant reminder of their entombment. Inside the small chamber, a fragile truce was born of necessity. With Edward's steady guidance, they used a shattered timber from the entrance and strips of cloth to splint the injured man's leg. Emma, her face illuminated by the single lantern, moved with a quiet competence that belied the terror of their situation. She cleaned the man's wound as best she could, her touch gentle. Silas Thorn watched it all, his pistol now lying uselessly on the rock beside him. The power dynamic had shifted completely. His gun, his threats, his authority meant nothing 100 feet inside a mountain. Here, the only currency was knowledge, fortitude, and compassion, qualities he sorely lacked. He saw Emma not as the troublesome girl he'd dismissed, but as the only reason his man wasn't bleeding to death in the dark. Edward, meanwhile, was assessing their prison. He examined the rockfall at the entrance, his experienced eye searching for any weakness, any glimmer of hope. "It's wedged tight," he said, his voice grim. "We'll never move it from this side. We'll have to be dug out." The reality of their predicament settled heavily on them all. They had air for now, coming through small fissures in the rock. They had a little water dripping down one wall, but they had no food and only enough kerosene for the lantern to last another day, maybe two. Fear, cold and sharp, was a living presence in the chamber. After the splint was set, an exhausted silence fell. To conserve the lantern oil, Edward turned the flame down to a bare flicker. In the near darkness, Thorn finally spoke, his voice raspy and stripped of its usual bluster. "Your father," he said, looking at Emma. "He told me he was close to finding something. Said the company owed his family. I thought he'd gone mad from the grief of losing your mother." Emma said nothing, simply held the old journal in her lap. The truth needed no defense. The quiet dignity of her silence was a more profound indictment than any accusation she could have leveled. The long night passed. They took turns sleeping, a fitful, dream-haunted rest. By morning, the storm had passed, but their tomb remained sealed. It was then that they heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping from the other side of the rockfall. Hope, sharp and breathtaking, surged through the chamber. Someone was looking for them. Edward, using the head of the pickaxe, began to tap back, a slow, deliberate pattern. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. An answer came immediately, a direct echo of his signal. They were not forgotten. They were going to be saved. The rescue took 2 full days. Men from Redemption, organized by the livery owner who had noted Edward and Emma's long absence, had formed a search party. They had found the mules and the fresh rock slide. Working tirelessly, they dug and cleared the tons of rock and debris that blocked the entrance. When the opening was finally cleared enough for a man to squeeze through, the first face they saw was not a rescuer, but the town circuit judge, Judge Miller, who had ridden up from the county seat on his monthly rounds and joined the search. He took in the scene inside. The injured man, the exhausted but resolute faces of Emma and Edward, and the cowed, dirt-stained figure of Silas Thorne. Edward simply handed the judge the tin box. Jonathan Whitcomb's Lost Survey and Journal Judge, from 1806. Judge Miller, a man known for his meticulous nature and sharp mind, sat on a rock and began to read the journal by the light of a fresh lantern. The townspeople who had crowded around the entrance fell silent, watching the slow, deliberate process of justice. An hour passed. When the judge finally looked up, his face was grave. He recognized the names of the company's founding partners. He recognized the legal structure of the original claim, and he recognized the clear, detailed evidence of fraud. He held up the heavy ore sample. "I'll need this assayed," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet air. "But this journal, this is a legally binding document, a last will and testament of a kind." He looked at Emma, his gaze holding a newfound respect. "Miss Whitcomb, it would appear your family is the rightful owner of this mountain." The news spread through the small crowd like a slow-burning fire. The whispers that had once been filled with mockery were now filled with awe. They looked at Emma, this quiet, stubborn woman they had dismissed as a fool, and saw a figure of incredible strength. Silas Thorne was taken into custody, not for attempted murder, but for the quieter, more damning crime of claim-jumping and conspiracy to defraud. His downfall wasn't a shootout in the street, but a quiet signature on a legal document. He was humbled, his power broken not by a bullet, but by a truth written in faded ink 77 years earlier. As Emma stepped out of the mine and into the bright, clean sunlight, she felt the weight of her father's long struggle lift. She had not just cleared his name, she had restored his legacy. The people of Redemption parted for her as she walked past, their faces a mixture of apology and admiration. She had gone into the mountain alone and scorned, and had come out the steward of its history. Weeks later, the golden light of a late autumn afternoon settled over the high basin. The air was crisp with the coming winter, but the sun was warm on the golden aspen leaves. Proper work had begun at the mine entrance, not with the frantic greed of a gold rush, but with the careful, deliberate work of engineers shoring up the passage to make it safe. The Consolidated Mercy Mining Company, faced with the irrefutable proof in the journal and the judge's ruling, had been forced to concede the claim. Their lawyers had offered a settlement, a vast sum of money to make the problem go away. Emma had refused. It was never about the money. Edward Pike stood beside her on the ridge overlooking the waterfall. He had stayed, helping her navigate the legal complexities, his quiet strength a constant anchor. The waterfall, no longer a barrier, was now a beautiful guardian, its roar a song of vindication. It had kept its secret well. The engineers say the silver vein is one of the richest ever found in these mountains, Edward said, his gaze on the distant peaks. They want to know what you're going to call the mine, the official name for the territorial registry. Emma looked at the water, then at the dark entrance to the mine, then at the vast, wild land that stretched out before them. She thought of her great-great-grandfather, writing his last words by candlelight. She thought of her father, searching for a truth he could feel but not yet see. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, a path of grief and grit. "I don't think it needs a new name," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I think it's always been called the inheritance." The word hung in the clean mountain air, filled with a meaning far greater than ore or silver. The inheritance wasn't the mine. It was the resilience, the truth, the unbreakable line of conviction passed down through generations. It was the story the mountain had kept for her. Thank you for joining us for this story to the very end. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in the ground, but are found in the quiet courage to honor the past. If you were moved by Emma's journey, please leave a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of the American frontier, where history is always waiting to be rediscovered. We'll see you next time.